Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Gentlemen for Cinephiles. It's the final day of Alfred August, and I'm here with a special guest.
Hi there, Sean Forst, lecturer in UCCS Film Studies and Film History in the VAPA department. Thank you for having me.
Amazing actor.
Oh well,
You left that off.
If you say so, I appreciate it, and I will take the praise.
Scholar of Hitchcock.
The only reason I'm sitting here and getting to do what I do is because of Alfred. I wrote my thesis on him in grad school to get my MA. So I think that's what we're talking about a little bit today is what I was trying to dig up with Hitch that everyone knows all about Alfred Hitchcock, of course, and happy belated birthday to him as well.
Oh, yes.
But it's all about finding something new when you're researching a legendary filmmaker. And I knew back then that in grad school I wanted to write about Hitchcock. But I didn't know how to tap into something untouched, some new fertile ground, because everything has been written about Hitchcock. Everything's been talked about, as you know.
I like Vertigo. Best movie of all time.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
Right, of course. I mean, how many books have been written about just the colors of Vertigo, which of course are beautiful.
Too many.
And the structure of Vertigo, of course. I mean, volumes and volumes of books just to each of his films, and of course the films warrant that. But it was just the tough nut to crack was what hasn't been talked about with Hitchcock as much, what's not in the discourse as readily available. So that's what my advisor and myself were trying to figure out. How do we crack this? Because he was fully supportive of me looking into Hitchcock, but what could we bring that wasn't talked about ad nauseum, essentially? Because every film scholar, every film writer and theorist uses Hitchcock's films as a template, and of course mostly Vertigo. So
it's a good movie. It's people talk about it a lot.
one of the best of the golden era, for sure. So I know we'll be talking about that a little bit today. So I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but I'll throw it back to you, Erynn.
Oh man, gosh, I was just hoping you'd talk a little bit. No, I'm just kidding. So yeah, the thing that always really interested me about Hitchcock, and the thing I wanted to do with this whole series of Alfred August, was kind of, give a lens to and a platform, I guess, to certain Hitchcock films that not a lot of scholars talk about, or like that's not really discussed a lot. I had the privilege of being in a Hitchcock class where I got exposed to a ton of that. But one of the films we actually didn't even watch in that class was I Confess, and Sean actually here did an amazing talk about it at school. And I think, the whole Catholic lens behind Hitchcock is something we've talked about a pinch during the series, like when the discussion of his parents come up, but it's something not a lot of people talk about, which is interesting because he comes from an Edwardian era, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So talk to me a little bit about that, Sean, because your basis for your thesis was the Catholic Hitchcock, correct?
Exactly. That is
possibly a book, perhaps.
One day we're inching towards it, and I'd love to, but we're trying to get the ducks in a row there. So that's the hope, yes. But
exclusive Gentlemen for Cinephile news tea.
Absolutely, this is your hot take, Miss Mitchell. So what we have, that's exactly what we were trying to dig up in about 10 years ago now, getting close to 10 years ago. My God, was Hitchcock and faith, because not. So much is written about Hitchcock's films, but what about Hitchcock the man? What about Hitchcock as a human being like the rest of us? Where did he come from, and what kind of shaped him in his youth and going forward into his adulthood and into his extraordinary career? And so we found kind of an anchor that I got very excited about with Hitchcock's religious upbringing, particularly his Roman Catholic upbringing. So using the Catholic Hitchcock as sort of a template, which became the title, just trying to investigate that upbringing and how it arguably shaped a lot of his films, a lot of his work going forward, whether he consciously meant to or not. I think the imagery is so potent in quite a few of his films. And particularly, as Erynn mentioned, I Confess, which is, again, a film that's not necessarily in the Hitchcock discourse often, in the realm of discussion and analysis of his career, of his body of work. So that was one of the films I wanted to use as a case study in the thesis is, what does a film like I Confess, which has a very, very strong backbone of Catholicism that runs throughout the film's narrative of a priest who's accused of murder, essentially. Father Logan, played by Montgomery Clift, the great Montgomery Clift. Great cast in the film, Ann Baxter, Carl Malden supporting it, and a film that is entirely entrenched in Catholic ritual, Catholic belief. The reason that Father Logan becomes the wrongfully accused man, again, such a well-worn, well-familiar Hitchcock convention, the wrong man accused of a crime, accused of a murder. In the context of I Confess is he's a priest bound to his sacred oath of keeping a confession between himself and the confessor and God, essentially, by doctrine. So he's bound to his oath as a Catholic priest to keep this confession to himself, and that's what lands him in this hotbed of trouble in the film's narrative, because he's so devout in his faith that he cannot simply tell the police. How everything in the film could be so simply resolved if he just said, yes, he confessed to me in the church that he murdered Mr. Gillette. But he can't do that. That's how seriously he takes the oath. And I think that Hitchcock wanted to tell this story particularly, and he was very keen on adapting this into film. It was a project that was very important to him. I think that said a lot in the research about how important faith was to him, at least at a kind of a subconscious level, because this is a film that he really, really wanted to make in the mid-50s, that he was at the height of the peak of his powers. Alfred Hitchcock could have made any film he wanted to in the 50s, and he chose deliberately to make I Confess, the story about a wrongfully accused priest, which I think says quite a lot about his strength of faith. Again, maybe at a more kind of subconscious level, but again, the terrain he knew so well, so he wanted to tackle this head on.
Yeah, and I love how you bring up the wrong man and kind of this relationship Hitchcock has to his faith, because it's almost like people don't even think about him in the realm of faith, because he kind of, I don't know, some of his archetypes are very, like, I suppose what people would traditionally say are critique of faith, I guess. I don't know. But just the spiritual nature of Hitchcock comes very grounded in Catholicism, and it always really intrigues me, because archetypes of his cinema, like The Wrong Man, X, Y, and Z, they all come from a very strong Catholic, rooting, I suppose. I was practicing for my childhood, just like I like to say. But I don't quite 100% know what I'm talking about. I like 70% know what I'm talking about.
You have a great grasp on it.
Oh yeah, thanks, John.
Totally.
I appreciate that. But yeah, so are there any other kind of archetypes that you see, Sean, that are kind of are rooted in his faith, I guess, that people don't necessarily see as such?
I do a bit. I think with characters like Father Logan in I Confess, again as example, and really in many of his films, this lone individual man who's trying to work against a system to figure out why he's been accused of a crime, really just kind of on his own. You can also think of Roger Thornhill in North by Northwest, for example. Why just this lone kind of male figure who's trying to fight the odds against him, and in a way that kind of goes back to Alfred Hitchcock's childhood of when he was kind of in this sea of Anglicanism in England, growing up in England. By his own words, he said, I was raised Catholic, which in England you see is an eccentricity.
Yeah.
So his family, not necessarily ostracized by that in the English community at all, but just that it's not common in the UK for Catholicism to be practiced. Protestantism and Anglicanism are really kind of the forefront Christian religions in the UK, but I think that kind of sort of isolation, at least from a faithful standpoint or a religious standpoint, kind of shaped some of these characters inadvertently, just kind of on their own, trying to figure out the world on their own in many ways and doing whatever that takes. So I think he spoke quite a bit about this sense of isolation that he felt growing up in school and so forth, just through faith and then just through other means, through his hobbies and interests. So I do think that forms the work a little bit too, going forward. So it's a hard argument to make. I try to use every piece of evidence I can find in the writing of the thesis of where Hitchcock is reminded of this faith, even when he becomes the most renowned filmmaker of all time, arguably, but certainly during his heyday, that was always something he was aware of. That he came back to it time and time again through his characters, through his narratives, and through his style, I think. We can even go back to his very first feature film, The Lodger, the story of the London Fog.
The Lodger?
Yes,
Just kidding.
The Lodger. Sorry. Which is the whole climax of the film is just rife with imagery of crucifixion. Of the wrongfully accused lodger. He's basically chastised by this crowd, this mob, that almost kind of hangs him in a cross-like fashion on the fence, as they accuse him of committing this crime. So just the beatings, almost kind of resembling whippings, things like that he experiences at the end. The woman coming to his rescue, kind of resembling La Pietà. After the death of Christ, so it's kind of there at the beginning, but then it comes up again and again going forward. So that was the argument that was attempted to be made, even in Rope, a very well-known Hitchcock film, unlike I Confess, well renowned for its technical facets. It's the remarkable cinematography of the film and the structure of it. But there's a lot of undertones, I think, there too, that it's sort of a complete perversion of Catholicism, of the faith, of the church, especially of Brandon, almost being this kind of antichrist figure who holds sort of a black mass over the tomb. And it kind of takes on like a ceremonial altar above this corpse. So poetic, Sean.
Oh, wow. I'm like, dang.
Thanks, dude. I mean, I appreciate that.
Do you just want to take over the podcast? No, I'm just kidding.
So I just with films like, even the better known films, I think there's still a weaving of this faith, of the iconography of the faith and of the tenets of it. So it's a tough case to make, but we tried our best.
Yeah. Before we get into the movie, I'm just super curious, like, why do you think it's so hard for people to equate? Because you see, like, filmmakers like Scorsese who are super Catholic filmmakers, as well as just filmmakers. He's not like a Catholic filmmaker, but he is in a way. Not in the way we think of it, I guess. He's not making like God's Not Dead, but he's his faith is entwined with his work, to phrase it better.
Absolutely.
Why do you think it's so hard for scholars to make that connection with Hitchcock?
I think really because it's just not, going back to the idea that it's not a known part of his personal life, because we don't have a lot on that. We haven't been given a lot of that even in the countless biographies about Hitchcock. Donald Spoto is kind of the foremost Hitchcock biographer, but he doesn't really.
Sorry.
Something I said.
I was about to be like, that was not a biography. That was a summary of all of his movies.
Yes, well, he does.
I'm gonna cut that out. Sorry,
he
Donald.
Does summarize very well. Donald,
Hitchcock liked your book.
Donald, no one doubts your Hitchcock authority.
We love you, Donald.
We're not criticizing you for that, but yes, a lot of summary
We're teasing you.
of what happens in his movies, of course. But a lot of what I was able to dig up comes from Donald Spoto, and but even still, it's so scarce. So I just don't think we equate Hitchcock with being kind of a filmmaker rooted in Catholicism, because there's just not enough of the research done necessarily. So that's what we were trying to do too, is contribute to that, fill in those gaps, plug the holes as best we can, because this is the best known director arguably ever in the world. So it just helps the discourse to just have as complete of information about him as we can. And unlike Marty Scorsese, almost all of his films have kind of a direct reference to Catholic iconography in some way, whether through the characters themselves who are usually very religious, very Catholic in practice, if not by lifestyle. We're always reminded of where Scorsese came from in his faith, because that is so present in the majority of his films. But again, Hitchcock, not necessarily. You can look at it symbolically as in Rope, as we talked about, but only in a couple of films do we outright get these sorts of depictions that we would get so often throughout Martin Scorsese's career, by comparison of characters who practice the faith. So there's only 2 or 3 Hitchcock films really where we get kind of this constant reminder of characters who are religious, who have a sense of faith to them. So I think that's a major reason why we don't always equate it, because we're constantly reminded by Martin Scorsese of his upbringing in the church. But in a way, it feels that Hitchcock didn't not necessarily suppress it, but just didn't feel called to call attention to it as outwardly, if that makes sense. Hopefully to everybody.
Yeah, that makes sense. Oh, great. Yeah, the thing I loved about Father Logan's character particularly is kind of, people do get caught up, and I think part of the reason I Confess isn't very studied is it's almost a frustrating film for people to watch because they just don't get it. You know what I mean? Yeah. They're like, why didn't you just say something? Blah, blah, blah. Right. And that's kind of what people get caught up in. But this whole idea that there's this higher duty that you have to follow, and that it doesn't matter, the circumstances around you. It's a very interesting character because in a lot of ways, I love Bob Fosse's work, and something that intrigues me all the time about Bob Fosse is that none of his characters change. And that's so interesting to me. You know what I mean?
Never.
Yeah, nobody changes. They're all the same as they, started. And but I think, with Father Logan, all of Hitchcock's characters go through this interesting arc. But with Father Logan, I don't know how much he does change compared to a lot of Hitchcock's other characters, but it's not in a negative way. It's in a way that's so self-assured, if that makes sense. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And I love with Bob Fosse's characters, just briefly, is yes, you either, as an audience member, you continue to love them by the end of the film, or you continue to hate them.
Oh, yeah.
So it just depends. But it's always hard to really hate a Hitchcock character because most of them are so charismatic in some way. But I think for Father Logan, Montgomery Clift's character is just that lack of change really speaks volumes, I think, to the importance of faith, to the narrative, to the character, and I would argue to the director as well. Because yes, to lay audience, an uninitiated audience
Yeah.
with Catholicism, the narrative is ludicrous.
Yeah.
You know, the whole thing could have been resolved in 10 minutes, of course, and we wouldn't have you wouldn't be in the theater that the entire run of the film if he just says, yeah, look, this guy came to me last night after he killed him and said, I killed Gillette, I killed the guy, right? There, that's that. You know, leave me alone. But there's such a resolute portrayal in this character, and I think Hitchcock really directed Monty Clift to kind of take that approach, because Clift himself was very much a method actor in this time, kind of the first school of method actors who really wanted to get into his character.
Stanislavski.
Yes, of course. Stanislavski's tradition. Reeling its head, so coming fresh out of the actor's studio almost. But it was, I think, that sort of getting in the head of the character really helped Clift give such a wonderful kind of understated performance. And that's the other thing about I Confess, I think, why it's also left off the kind of the Hitchcock canon so often, if you will, is it's such a restrained film stylistically and visually. Really, Hitchcock kind of leaves off his usual flair in this movie, which I think is remarkable too. It doesn't scream out as being a Hitchcock movie. There's not one kind of singular shot or moment that we can remember or that just gets seared into our mind from Psycho and Rear Window, Vertigo, The Birds.
The Man Who Knew Too Much.
Of course. I mean, just really almost any other of his films. We have all these endearing shots and images. But I Confess really lacks that. And I think that's because Hitchcock didn't, and what I tried to argue is that Hitchcock didn't want his style, his flair to kind of overshadow what this narrative is about. And I feel that because it was something very personal to him, very important to him. So we really don't get the usual Hitchcock grandiose bombacity, if you will. And so that's something that's always struck out to me about the film as well, that there's nothing that tells us except for the opening and closing title cards that this is an Alfred Hitchcock.
Yeah, which is something I love a lot about it too. And then with that whole kind of nature of the style, I mean, I haven't really thought much about Anne Baxter's character, which is ironic because I like Anne Baxter a lot. Sorry, Anne. But with The Wrong Man, you have this, like, it almost feels like, you know, with the wrong man stereotype, there almost has to be a built-in woman behind the wrong man who, like, is kind of, because for Hitchcock, all the women are always the key holders, and they're always the ones that kind of understand what's going on before everyone else does. And Anne Baxter still kind of serves that function, but in a different kind of way because of the way faith is intertwined into it too. Because it almost feels at times she kind of understands, and she's the closest to understanding, but it never really reaches fully understanding still. But I don't know. What are your thoughts, John?
I think she's supportive of Logan throughout the entire film. She, as we know, she doesn't waver in her faith of him, though she doesn't necessarily come from this position of faith herself. I mean, we don't know, we're not given that information about her character, because the film taking place in Quebec, which is a largely Catholic population. It's very likely that she is a part of the church as well, but we don't, we're not given that in the narrative. But she knows what's at stake for Father Logan. She of course, they were very much in love before he decided to take his vows and join the priesthood. Very sad flashback, of course. So she knows what's at stake. She's able to kind of rise above what she would have wanted herself, which is a loving relationship with this person, because she understands that he was called to something higher in his mind. And she's even, we learn from the flashbacks as well that she's giving, realizing that importance by letting him take this path, but wanting to still support him, because we have that moment where, if it had been discovered that they were in love, at some point she says he would have been defrocked.
Yeah.
His priesthood would have ended in scandal, and so she doesn't want that to happen. She wants to make sure that his sort of sanctity of the position is upheld. So she really kind of, I think, is a rather selfless character in the movie, because she doesn't. She would have loved to have had a life with him, I think, and as an audience, we kind of would have liked that as well.
It's a little age of innocence.
Yes, extremely. But again, she's able to kind of move past that for this idea of the greater good for what Logan's decided to do with his life as a priest. So she's definitely the she's definitely the rock, I think, of the film.
Yeah, like most Hitchcock women, but
yeah,
she's never quite that femme fatale, femme fragile.
No,
she kind of exists in the liminal space between the two.
Right.
But another thing that really intrigues me is kind of this narrative twist at the end, almost, because what is his name? Oh my gosh, I'm completely spacing. Oh my gosh, the guy who actually killed someone. Oh my god. It's just the
Keller.
Keller. Thank you. I'm so sorry. I'm like, Sean, come on my episode.
Took me a second too. Sorry.
Keller? So Keller, the way his turn at the end when he gets shot is super intriguing to me, because it Hitchcock's kind of critical of Catholicism-ish sometimes, but then you really see his faith come through, because, seeing it almost feels like Hitchcock is in creating a higher power, I guess, almost too, because there's still kind of this paying for what was done that happens, even though, the Father Logan is trying to protect him the whole time. But, yeah.
I think it is a really beautiful ending to the film, to be honest. Because even after Keller essentially has ruined this man's life.
Oh, yeah.
Because leading up to that, we again get a parallel to the ending of The Lodger, from 30 years before. The Lodger. From 30 years before, where this protagonist who we've sympathized with and know has been wrongfully accused is set upon by this mob, because Father Logan comes out of the courthouse, and it's very much, again, a really direct kind of reflection, I feel, of kind of the scourging of Christ before the crucifixion, and how the mob spits at him, jeers at him, and tears at him. We get all these kind of visual cues, I think, of Hitchcock being mindful of his faith there. But even so, at the end of it all, he never breaks his vow, despite what Keller thinks. And even after everything Keller's done to him, Logan is still willing to hear his final confession, to give him his last rites before he passes away, so that he can die again in the lens of Catholicism, so that he can die in kind of the good graces of God, and hopefully go forth to heaven with the priest's blessing. So again, that's the whole resolution of the film is so entwined with a Catholic resolution as well. So the idea that you can be forgiven for your sins and possibly still gain entry to paradise. So there's that idea is kind of played with as well. So the protagonist and the antagonist, it's hard to call Keller a villain in the film, because he really doesn't have those hallmarks of a Hitchcock villain.
The duotagonist, or whatever that term is.
He's a very scared individual throughout the film. He's not this criminal mastermind. He's a very scared immigrant who doesn't know quite what's going to happen. And so I think there is a lot of tenderness to the ending of the film, again rooted in this sense of the Catholic resolution. Robert von Dostoevsky pointed out when we screened the film.
Robert von Dostoevsky, I'm just kidding.
The RVD, who pointed out when we screened the film that Keller is a German immigrant who's in Canada in the film, and so he's very much this other. And we're in the post-World War II period where he would have been kind of ostracized and kind of been outcasted himself. So that's, I think Hitchcock does take a sympathetic view towards Keller as well.
Well, and I think that a lot of that comes from, Hitchcock's always kind of tried to distance himself in terms of, like, critiquing a whole culture, I suppose. And you see that, like, in his pre-war films, like Lady Vanishes, X, Y, and Z. But yeah, that's a really good point. I didn't even think about it, because I didn't even realize he was a German immigrant.
Yeah, I mean, we're not explicitly told that, but his accent very heavy. Yeah. So that's definitely a way to look at it too. And just kind of a brief aside, which we talked about it after the screening as well, is this was, again, a film that doesn't bear the usual Hitchcock flourishes and trademarks, and that gave Warner Brothers a really hard time figuring out how to market this movie.
The trailer for this is especially funny.
It was just, it's really kind of laughable because we looked at the poster, if you recall, where it's the painted poster of Montgomery Clifton and Baxter, and he's not dressed up in his priest garments. He's not wearing his collar or his frock or anything. But he's kind of dressed up in a suit, I believe, and then he's looming over Ann Baxter, holding his hand over her mouth, like, "Don't you dare confess what's been done here." And it gives it a very ominous look.
Who was the head of Warner Brothers at the time? Was it still the Four Brothers, or was that a long past?
We'd lost one of them at this point. But Jack Warner was always really the one in charge of the studio going forward. But I believe it was Sam who passed away.
Maybe we should be happy that, like, Harry Cohn didn't get his hands on it or something.
So it was just a real idea, I think, that they didn't know how to market this to a secular audience, to a wider audience, because it's a kind of narrative that if you weren't a Catholic, or if you weren't aware of Catholic practices and traditions, then you just wouldn't understand why is this film even happening? Why is this being dragged out? Why can't he just say what happened? But that's the whole point that Hitchcock is trying to stress, that this is Logan is acting towards a higher authority, something greater than himself, as you said, and he's committed to that. So it was a hard way. I think the studio had a really hard time marketing and selling this film, but Hitchcock insisted on it. So that's why we get a poster that tries to make it look almost like a film noir, tries to make it look like a murder.
Like a weird...
a
weird drive-in thing with Montgomery Clifton and Baxter.
Exactly. So look that up, you listeners. The poster for I Confess, it's pretty...
Not good.
It's pretty laughable. But this is a way... And this, obviously, of course, we know still happens today with films that a studio doesn't know how to sell, so they'll try to sell it as something else than it is. And I think I Confess.
Any recent examples, Sean?
Of that. Let's see. Well, I think Midsummer would be a great example.
Did you see it?
I have seen it this weekend. I promise.
Oh my God.
But
I'm so excited. Are you seeing the director's cut or the cut?
Yeah.
Oh my God, John.
Don't worry.
I told somebody to take me, and you didn't take me. I'm so betrayed.
When you were going, I'm sorry I couldn't go.
I'm totally kidding.
I'm glad you've seen it, because you have to make up for.
I hope you don't hate it.
Lack here. No, but reading about it though is again trying to market it as a strict kind of horror movie, which it isn't.
Oh my God, no.
I mean, there's elements to it, but it goes beyond that, and I think that's an example of a studio wanting to attach their films to genres, because audiences know genres. They can recognize a film and determine whether to see it based on the genre. So it's easier for studios to pigeonhole movies that they're releasing into these genres, as we know. That's one of the tenets of genre filmmaking is you can easily classify it. And Hitchcock's films, I mean, he really defied that kind of easy genre classification very often, but especially with a movie like I Confess, which is not, which has some genre elements, but is really strays from kind of these traditional ideas of a genre film, I think. So that plays into it as well. The marketing of I Confess as a much different sort of Hitchcock movie.
Yeah. Some good points, Sean.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate it.
Let me see if I have anything else. I'm so excited that you're going to see Midsommar.
Yeah.
Who are you going with? I'm just curious.
Well, my friend who saw it when it first came out,
Okay,
he's coming back to town for the weekend, and he's like, so he told me, by the way, we're seing this, so you don't have a choice.
I was scared it was like, I'm going on Midsommar, it's a date. And I was like, don't do it.
Erin's reaching across right now, just saying, don't
Sean,
do that.
Don't go on a date to Midsommar.
She's like grabbing. It's a very violent scene in here, folks. So
I'm managing to not knock any of the furniture. I'm managing to just threaten Sean.
It's a plush office, very nice office.
Oh my gosh, wow, fancy.
But yes,
yeah.
well, I'm excited. But he's kind of basically told me it's a crime that I haven't seen this, so I'm taking you to see it.
I love that. It's so good. Oh my god, I don't know if I should tell you this before or after, Sean, but it's on my top 10 films that describe me.
Really?
It replaced Rosemary's Baby.
Whoa, so
Yeah.
that's big.
It's real good.
That's big. I know how important that movie is to you.
So
So
thank you. Oh my god. Well.
Exactly.
I also don't want you to watch it and be like, what the fuck does she mean? Top 10 films to describe her.
No.
What the hell is she talking about?
Don't even worry.
Great. So, Sean, as a Hitchcock scholar, I'd love to know, well, I guess, what other films do you kind of see this through line?
Well, and
You said I Confess was your case study. What was the other?
by the way, I'm honored that you would call me a Hitchcock scholar.
Oh my god, you
It's very
are
kind of
one.
you. But I would definitely, I Confess is really kind of at the peak there, but really I look at Rope as a strong case study as well, just for sort of the idea of playing God in a very perverse, macabre way.
Yeah.
Of a mortal man viewing himself as God, essentially. And
What
then
kind of mind?
my favorite, honestly, one of my favorite monologues of the Hitchcock-overe is, of course, Jimmy Stewart at the end of Rope when he's solved the case, and he turns to Brandon and says, "You think you were God, Brandon? Is that what you thought when you threw food from his grave? When you choked the life out of him?" And it gives me chills.
I've never
still.
heard this Jimmy Stewart coming shot.
So it's I think that's the moment that really clinches it for me when looking at Rope is that he's acting almost as kind of this agent of faith, even though he's not. We know he's not really he doesn't have religious predilections in the film as a character, as this intellectual in the film.
Yeah.
But he still kind of act as this agent of morality of this faith-based greater good idea that's it's not up to human beings to decide when a life ends, essentially. So I find the ending of Rope very powerful for that reason.
I'm gonna clumsily ask this really quick before you go into your next Hitchcock movie, because we had this whole kerfuffle discussion, and it wasn't a kerfuffle, it was a discussion on the Rope podcast, because we were like, how weird must it be for this professor, this scholar, etc., to realize that somebody so grossly misinterpreted what he was lecturing.
Exactly.
Like, Sean, you're a professor, a lecturer, a professor. Are you ever scared of that? What does that feel like? How does it feel to discuss things you don't agree with? Or how does it feel to discuss ideology you don't agree with? Like, do you feel responsible, like, for what students believe? Like, I don't know. I'm just curious. It's a big question.
That's the biggest question there
I'm
is.
so sorry.
So, I don't, you have to, as any kind of teacher, you have to present, I think, every gamut of ideology and perspective. Otherwise, you're doing a disservice to your students.
Yeah.
And that's very important to me. And I never try to promote an ideology that I might believe in personally very strongly. Maybe it seeps out sometimes, but I don't believe it's a teacher's place to say that their ideology is the best one, is the correct one, and if you disagree, then get out of the classroom. That's not the way I ever wanted to do things.
I almost shot a couple times. I was afraid. No, I'm just kidding.
But the idea of hopefully shaping minds is never lost on me, and so you have to be mindful of really anything you say that has sort of an ideological connection, because there's so much to weigh there. So I think there's times, yes, we've talked about films and filmmakers from an ideology, from their point of view, that you can't deny an ideology is being promoted or criticized, and that's always going to happen. But it's your job as the intermediary, as the teacher, to kind of present the pros and cons of that, the all sides of that presentation, and to really turn it back to the students too, is to ask not necessarily what they believe, but do you agree with this? Do you disagree? Is this problematic? Is this fair or unfair? What do you guys think about this? Because it's not, especially for me, it's not all about what I think and want to tell you guys. It's what do you think about it too? We want you guys to be the thinkers as well, of course. So how do you respond to it? So maybe, I hope that doesn't sound like deflecting, but it's like this. I might have my beliefs, but that's not what's important. It's what kind of beliefs and critical opinions are you guys forming? That's what we're here for. Yeah. So I don't believe in standing on a soapbox, as you know, I hope, and proclaiming to the classroom that this is how things should be.
I don't know, Sean. You really went off about baby geniuses one time. I'm just kidding.
Well, we're talking about ideologies, movies. On the other hand,
you're like whoa.
Movies, on the other hand, I don't make many bones about calling out the shit.
I'm just kidding.
So, I sometimes relish those moments. So we're going down a different rabbit hole there. But I just think when it comes to ideologies and institutions, belief systems, all of that, it's not my place to kind of come from just one point of view, or to just I guess lecture from one point of view, for lack of a better phrase. Yeah. I don't think it's right to say that what you think, and we've all had these teachers growing up and in college of who won't budge in their personal beliefs, and who won't shy away from belittling students who don't necessarily agree with their beliefs, and I witnessed that very often as a student myself, and I don't think that's right. And I always told myself, if I ever get the chance to do this, I wouldn't do that either. And so I hope I've been true to that. But I think you have to let everyone have their opinions and their beliefs and their ideologies, as long as it doesn't infringe on anyone else or threaten anyone else. So.
Are you scared that you're going to introduce an ideology that maybe you don't agree with and somebody's going to misinterpret it?
Sure.
And then kill somebody and then invite you over to a dinner party and be like, I killed someone. Are you so proud of me?
Is this like a Manson syndrome we're talking about? I think. Well, I look. There's times. I mean, I'll be very honest in this. In this podcast, there's times that there's topics when it comes to, you look on your syllabus like, oh God, we're getting close to that day, or that film or that figure, and it's like you have to talk about them in this discourse, and but you get nervous sometimes how students are going to respond. You can't always predict that, but. There are times where something might be controversial or uncomfortable. I've been uncomfortable many times watching screening films with students that I worried might be problematic from that perspective.
I'm so sorry. I left during Cannibal Holocaust on it.
Well, you and 3/4 of the
It keeps
class.
me up at night sometimes. And God, I disappointed him.
But that was look. That was just another. That was the most extreme example, and that was one that I should have rethought because there's not really a way to make a point with showing a film like that without just upsetting most of the people. I mean, we had a 26 person class, and there were 4 people by the time the film was over, and I just basically knew I had to let it be. I didn't have really the right to say, no, you're going to sit here and you're going to watch this film.
You were going to watch Cannibal Holocaust and you were going to like it.
I don't care how uncomfortable you get. I mean, see, that's the other thing. You cannot teach from that perspective, or else you're going to alienate students. So that's another hard thing too, how they're going to gauge a topic, and in film studies, how they're going to gauge a film. And I've had those hesitations many times, and you have to just kind of roll with it and hope that you have a something to say about it. But things can always be interpreted in countless ways, so it's tricky. I remember in another example is we did the comedy class a couple of years ago, and we. I was planning to have a whole kind of day dedicated to Woody Allen and Annie Hall, but again, that Woody Allen's a figure who's controversial these days.
Who wouldn't show up for that? And then I was like, they said Woody Allen, I was like, oh, that's definitely me.
But see that exactly that's part of the thing is you talk about comedy film history, and Woody Allen has a place in there. People like Woody Allen, and then you have films that feature Kevin Spacey, for example, and it's hard because there's very seminal films that these sorts of figures have made. I mean, how many movies that you and I love have the name Harvey Weinstein attached to them? It's a tricky...
Mine is my problematic is Roman Polanski.
Well, and look, Roman Polanski is really on this list as well for people who might have issue with seeing the name. You know, just seeing any of these names can provoke a very strong reaction. And so that you have to weigh these things, and you have to decide at some point along the way. Okay, do we want to go forward with this? Do we want to talk about this or not? And that's never an easy decision. So. Yeah. Sorry, I hope that kind of
it totally answers my question. Sorry, Sean, that you weren't prepared for that at all. I didn't send that over to you in the initial ask for the podcast.
When we were going over what this would be about, that was never in the bullet points.
What kind of podcast is this? What did I sign up for?
You know what? I'm taking this mic off.
That's it. I'm leaving. Like, Sean, no.
You hear the door slam.
Okay, guys, I guess the podcast is done.
So I hope, but I hope that is sort of what you're asking.
Yeah, no, that's 100%. That's super interesting insight. It was a question we asked for Alfred August, but it's not like, Felicity, Evelyn, and I could answer, because we're not, like, in that position,
Right.
I'm teaching, like, a filmmaking seminar in October for an hour. Like, I'm not, those philosophical questions aren't coming up, you know what I mean? Like, it's different.
It is, and, and even when you're doing that, which is going to be very exciting, you always have to, let me rephrase that, you can't think what every individual in the room is possibly going to be upset with or happy with even. You can't gauge for every head that's kind of looking at you.
I didn't like that. I don't like that. I don't like that movie.
And when that happens, and it happens often, you just...
I don't know why, because philosophy behind our film department is it doesn't matter.
But see, you have to... when you get that, when you get negativity, you open up the dialogue.
Yeah.
You say, okay, that's fair. Why? Why not? Let's
I love
talk
your
about
Father
it.
Logan approach to teaching.
Yes, yes, but what I'm trying to learn is don't take it too personally, because this is everyone's there to you'll never be able to please everybody in the room with your selections of topics. So there's always things that are left off that you wish you could put in and leave in. But again, you're always fighting a clock, and you just have to find what speaks to you from the teaching perspective on the other side of the podium, what you think they'll get the most out of, and that whether that's in a positive sense or in a negative sense, what you think will really kind of push the class to think and view critically. So I think. That's what I would boil it down to, is whether it's positive or a negative experience at times. You don't seek those out necessarily, any kind of negativity, but when it happens, you kind of embrace it and then talk it through. But if you're not getting the feedback, even in that sense, then you always have to kind of learn, maybe it's time to move on, let's talk about the next film. The next figure, you can't dwell on something that if they don't want to necessarily.
Oh, okay.
So that you have to remember that too, because you can push them as far as you want to, but if you can tell that you're just hitting a roadblock, like the barrier is put up for discussion, it's just okay. Let's move on. That happens sometimes too. So.
So interesting, huh?
But you've seen all of this firsthand. So
I've been the most not negative the whole time, though. I just want to say I did tell Sean I would not show up for Annie Hall. I told him I wouldn't show up for The Exorcist because it scared me, and then he sent me an Exorcist happy birthday picture.
I did that.
You did.
That was mean. Yes.
It was years ago. I was so sad. I cried for a week. No, I'm just kidding.
That was very mean. I'm sorry.
You need to repent. Sean, I'm so upset.
The power of Christ compels me, I know. So I will try. I'll make amends for that someday.
Thank you. Okay, now I can finally get over it. 3 years later. No, I'm just kidding. That's great. Yeah. So any other Hitchcock films that speak Catholicism to you other than Rope?
Oh yes.
Because we got off on that one.
Wow. Yes. So that was the original question there.
Sorry.
Yes. So.
It's a little lodger, but.
The Lodger, really, go back to the beginning of Hitch's career, and I think you'll see some things that stand out from this faith perspective.
Yeah.
So the Lodger, the Rope.
I thought you were going to say The Room for a second. I don't know why my brain short-circuited like that.
Rope, of course, I confess.
Yes.
But also a very strong case, I think, is The Wrong Man. With Henry Fonda, Vera Miles. Again, another extremely understated Hitchcock film. Henry Fonda is this wrongfully accused man of holding up a convenience store. And it's not, the imagery isn't as present throughout The Wrong Man as it is in I Confess, but we're reminded throughout the film, Henry Fonda is a character who does have some religious beliefs. We see at the police station that they search him. One of the things they take out of his pocket is the rosary with the beads and the crucifix on it. So that's kind of our first visual cue of who this character is. And that Hitchcock focuses on that with the camera for quite a while, of the police taking out this rosary from his pocket. And as he's imprisoned for the night. And really the resolution, we've talked about the resolution of I Confess being kind of a Catholic perspective. What we get in The Wrong Man, that's right. We're getting blinded in here. In The Wrong Man, it really kind of, we get sort of deliverance for the character from above, essentially, because it really feels Hitchcock manipulates the scene deliberately to make it appear that Manny, Henry Fonda's character, his fate is resolved by divine intervention in a sense, because his mother tells him to pray for guidance, for salvation, and for himself. So the very next scene is he looks at the image of Jesus on his bedroom wall, and we see him start to move his mouth in an act of prayer. And then as he's doing that, Hitchcock dissolves the scene, superimposes Henry Fonda's face with I can't remember the actor's name, but who is actually the one who committed the crime, superimposing his face above in front of Henry Fonda. So we now see who the real criminal is, right as he tries to rob another convenience store in his cot. So this is the most kind of deliberate, I think, act of Hitchcock's career, where he shows what the power of faith can be. That right at this moment, as Manny prays for guidance, for safety, and for the resolution, is when Hitchcock kind of grants him and the audience this relief through an act of prayer. So a really remarkable scene in the film that Hitchcock really is clearly deliberately showing that this prayer is what is saving his life, essentially. So I think that's another strong case in the career, and then another film that is not that well known. Henry Fonda being one of the biggest actors in Hollywood history, in a Hitchcock film, it's extraordinary, but it's not one of the best known in his career or Hitchcock's career, which is interesting. But at least they got to work together. But it's, again, very tonally and stylistically a somber film. There's not a lot of Hitchcock's hand in it, apart from what we learn in the title cards. So that's what I think is pretty important there too. So definitely The Wrong Man I would include on that list. But towards the end of his life, Hitchcock, he was not. I always get a little sad because he didn't have the pull that he did in the 40s through the 60s, and he was really on his decline in his career and his health, of course, into the 70s.
Do you like Family Plot?
I think it's definitely one of his weakest movies. I hate to say, but again, he was really nearing the end at that point in the late 70s. His health was failing him, and he was really kind of becoming an alcoholic, which is sad too. And he was rumored to have said in his office on the Universal Studios backlot, he says, Don't admit any priests to come see me. They're all after me. Because he kind of thought, I think he kind of knew in a way that he was nearing the end, and he just thought, the presence of a priest would hasten
make it quicker.
So I think he was just kind of afraid of that. But he also did say to Francois Truffaut, I believe, in the wonderful book that everyone listening needs to read, Hitchcock Truffaut, where they had a series of interviews together that he recorded and wrote down in the transcript.
I'm sorry, I just kicked you.
But
I didn't mean to. I'm sorry.
but he says to Truffaut, no one, I'm paraphrasing, no one knows what the end holds, what the afterlife holds, but Catholics have their hope, essentially. So I think he really did hold to this faith despite his own problems with it, with the church at times, and despite his own misgivings and his own doubts.
Mm-hmm.
I think really at the end of his life he was kind of accepting of it, and more open to it. So I think there is something to be said there, and the argument that tried to be made, I hope it, if nothing else, I just hope it adds to the Hitchcock discourse of the countless other things, infinite resources about him. Just the hope that maybe there's one more perspective on the great Alfred Hitchcock that we can kind of look at and evaluate and critique and argue about as we will about all of his films and his career. And that's the mark, of course, of a great director. Yeah. So I that's, if nothing else, I hope it does sort of make us think, well, maybe there's another side to Hitchcock we should look at. Yeah. So that's the hope to it all, I think, in the end, if nothing else.
That's very beautiful. There's a tear
going
down my
Oh, gosh.
Okay, Sean, you're not off the hook yet. The eternal question. You could give me a 5 or a 10. It's up to you. Give me your top 10 or 5. Or 5, because this is a big thing to spring on someone. If Vertigo's number 1, you could just leave. No, I'm just kidding.
You're talking Hitchcock, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
No.
Like of all time?
Yeah.
Now you're
all
really
time,
springing it
Sean.
over here.
No, I'm just kidding.
Let's do 5,
Okay.
if that's all right, since you're catching me off guard. I got 10 I
5
have to
is
think
totally
about,
cool, yeah.
a little bit more. But I would say in ascending order, 5, I would probably say Rope. And 4, I think I would say the Man Who Knew Too Much.
Which one?
Jimmy Stewart.
I mean, obviously not the
Dorsey.
30s, but I'm thinking.
Jimmy Stewart and Dorsey. How can you ever top that? I think 3. Oh, this is getting tricky now. 3. Rear Window. 2. North by Northwest.
Really quick with Rear Window. Well, you think of your number 1, which better not be Vertigo. No, I'm just kidding. Have you seen Dana Carvey's SNL audition?
Oh, not his audition, but
He does the Jimmy Stewart from Rope,
Oh.
or from Rear Window, and
Yeah.
it's so good.
One of my favorite all-time SNL skits, though, is from the 90s. It was a Christmas episode, and they do the alternate ending of It's a Wonderful Life.
I love it.
Have you
It's
seen
so
that?
Good.
Well, I didn't know I had such great friends.
And then don't they all come in and kill him?
Then they find out, of course, Mr. Potter was the villain all along, so they go, well, let's go get him. So he beats the crap out of John Lovitz is playing Mr. Potter, and he just beats the crap out of him. And my favorite part is he falls behind the desk, and so Dana Carvey runs behind and grabs what's obviously just become this dummy, and he starts throwing him around. It's just fantastic. That's maybe my all-time favorite SNL skit. Well, I want a piece of you, old man.
Dana Carvey's Jimmy Stewart is just so good. Also, yours was really good, Sean. I've never heard you do Jimmy Stewart.
That was a one-time thing, everybody. So.
Damn it.
But thank you. I appreciate it.
At least I have it on film. Recorded on film. Question mark.
But number 1, gosh, this is hard.
It's okay if it's Vertigo.
It really isn't. It really isn't. I love it, but it's not number 1. I'm glad we kind of got off topic there, because I was trying to delay it. But I gotta say, number 1 for me is Psycho. So I think it just still is so strong. And just for how what it did for the horror genre going forward.
You're a really kind guy, Sean. You kind of
just
give up on Norman Bates before you find out, Sean. What are you trying to say? No, just kidding.
But that's a tough list. I don't know. Maybe we do need to do a 10, but that one I'll have to think about a little more. So
I'm gonna ask you for it.
to come back to you for that.
I'm gonna check that top 10 Hitchcock.
All right. I mean, it's malleable for sure, but I think those are the ones that just. I mean, most Hitchcock movies for me, and I know for us, is like if it's on, you'll watch it. So you'll just sit down and watch it. But those 5, I can always just find time to watch, without worrying about anything else I might have to do in the day.
It's a Tuesday. Let's put on Psycho.
So that's what I'm going to stick with for now. But that it always might
it's going down in history, Sean. This is your only top 5 list of Hitchcock you can ever have ever. Just kidding. Great. Well, Sean, do you have any last thoughts?
You guys probably covered this, and I know actually you did cover it. I think in one of the other Alfred.
Oh my God!
August,
did you listen?
But did you? What was your 5?
My 5.
I'm trying to remember.
My 5. They're probably. I'm not gonna put them in order because I don't know how to. I really like. The Rope and the Man Who Knew Too Much are probably my top 2. The Doris Day one.
Mm-hmm.
I love Marnie. I really like The Lodger. The Lodger, and then
I know you're a big Notorious fan.
Notorious, yeah, that's the one. That's my actual number 1 Hitchcock is Notorious. Oh my God.
Yes.
Oh my God. Oh. Just Claude Rains and how sad he is at the end just kills me.
You feel terrible for him. I mean, obviously,
he loves her so much he's willing to die for her.
Yes.
Oh my God, that unrequited love gets me in cinema, Sean. But that's my top 5, Sean. What are your thoughts on my top 5?
Fantastic list.
Great.
Very solid.
I feel validated. Thank you.
Well, not that you need to, but really, I think that's foolproof.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Airtight. Yes.
Thank you so much. Oh, that's so kind. But where can they find you, Sean?
What's that?
Where can they find you? Not physically.
You
like,
you guys. Well, you can find me at UCCS.
I'm there on
usually the first half of the week. But you can also find me on Instagram.
Wow, what's your Instagram?
It's CO Colorado. Well, CO short for Colorado Movie Buff. Very cliche, I know.
If you
but,
move, are you gonna change the?
I guess I would have to. You gotta stick to my.
Move to Vegas, LV Movie Buff.
And anytime, feel free. We can always chat about movies. That's what Erynn and I do, and what we're all here for anyway. Why we're doing this, our love of film. So
the only thing in life that brings me joy is talking about movies.
That is, I mean that's so true on multiple levels for me as well. So
everything else just sucks.
Why do you think I wanted this job?
Why do you think I wanted to be on the cast?
I'm kidding, but thank you, Erynn. It was a pleasure.
No, thank you, Sean. I appreciate it. Guys, go follow him. He posts about his movies, and he takes a really good videography of the places he goes.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. I appreciate that. But yes, we'll many more episodes of Gentlemen Prefer Cinephiles to come. So keep your ears out.
Yes. Okay, we just got accepted on Stitcher, so you can find us on Stitcher now, as well as iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and the iTunes store, and wherever else I'm forgetting. And Spotify, yeah, that one. We are waiting to hear back from iHeartRadio still, so fingers crossed, everybody. But yeah, thank you all so much. Thank you for being here for Alfred August. I'm super excited to announce that Pete Schuerman will be joining us next on the weekly show to talk about a director horror stories.
The Pete Schuerman.
The Pete Schuerman. Okay, well, thank you so much, Sean, for being on the podcast. I really appreciate it the second time. Oh my gosh.
My pleasure. And I'll be listening in for sure to hear what Pete has to say and to see what you guys are going to be coming up with next. I can't wait.
Yes. Okay, bye everyone.
Thank you, guys.